Hi, I'm retired NYPD Detective Vic Ferrari, and welcome to NYPD Through the Looking Glass podcast, where you'll get unique insight into the New York City Police Department. Before we get started, I encourage you to check out my Amazon author page, where you'll find my series of behind-the-scenes NYPD books. They're $10 paperback or $2.99 ebook download, including my NYPD Behind the Blue Wall of Silence. Today's guest is an author of a great book, Greg Scarpa, Legendary Evil, The Many Faces of a Mafia Killer. Jonathan Dyer, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Vic.
Jonathan, please introduce yourself. Tell our listeners a little something about yourself.
Well, Vic, I joined the Army in 1981 and was kind of kicking around Berkeley, didn't have much else to do. And the Berkeley recruiter was very glad to see me because he was kind of a lonely guy. And I went to Russian language school in Monterey for a year and a half. And then I had some more intelligence training at Goodfellow Air Force Base and then at the National Security Agency. And then I went over and served in Berlin for 3 years at Field Station Berlin. I got married over there. After the Army, I attended law school, and after law school, I practiced law for about 10 years, mostly a civil litigation practice, but some criminal appellate practice too. And after practicing law for about 10 years, I decided to make a switch and became a teacher. And I taught history, government, and criminal law at the secondary level. And in 2020, during the pandemic, I retired. And I've been writing for about 30 years, and the book, Greg Scarpa, Legendary Evil, is my first work of nonfiction.
It's a great book, and there's so many mobsters in the New York City area to choose from, especially in the 70s and 80s. What motivated you to write a book about Greg Scarpa? Why him?
Well, I was working on some scripts with a friend of mine who's a writing partner, and they were based primarily around the life of Larry Mazza, one of the characters in this book. And this was Joe Paletto as my writing partner, and Joe suggested I write a biography of Greg Scarpa. And at first I hesitated. I hadn't written any nonfiction of that length. You know, I'd done academic work in school, but nothing book length. And he pushed kind of gently, and eventually I said, okay, let's take a shot at it. And, you know, I started researching. About 3 years later, had a book.
So just give us an overview. Tell us who Greg Scarpa was.
Yeah, Greg Scarpa was a gangster, a member of the mafia, first Profaci family. He barely finished high school, but my sense is that he was a very bright guy. And by the early 90s, he'd earned his button in the Profaci family. And then when Joe Profaci died, Scarpa continued on, and he was a member of the Colombo family and a good fellow. He had actually been a capo during the last years of the Profaci family and expected to be renamed by Joe Colombo, but that didn't happen. Instead, he was one of Joe Colombo's closest confidants. And according to Greg Scarpa Jr., that gave Greg Scarpa Sr. more power than a capo would have had in the Colombo family. And so he was a powerful member of a New York Mafia family. And in 1962, late 1961, the FBI approached him, and in 1962, he became a top echelon confidential informant. And so he's working both sides of the fence. From 62 to 75, when the FBI dropped him for about 5 years. And then he got picked up again by Agent Lynn DeVecchio in 1980 and continued in that guise until the end of the Third Colombo War in 1992, and he passed away in 94.
So can you go into how the FBI approached Greg Scarpa?
Sure. The original motivation is they were looking for Scarpa's brother, Sal, in connection with a hijacking beef. And they approached Greg, and by all accounts, Greg was very polite. He said, look, fellas, I can't do this. I'm not going to do this. Appreciate it. And they approached him a few times, and finally Scarpa told them, if you keep doing this, I'm going to get killed. People can't see me talking to you. And then for some reason, Scarpa had a change of heart. And in October of 1961, he contacted them and said, let's talk about that informant gig. And it just went very quickly from there. The FBI didn't really know much about the 5 families in New York in the early 60s, and they were just dying to try to get inside. And so when Scarpa came along and said, I'll play, this was like gold for the FBI.
It looked like from the onset, when this relationship started developing, Greg Scarpa was always manipulating the FBI. He played on their greed, and it looked like he was always testing them.
Well, yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. The documents are pretty clear. One of the first things Scarpa did was said, gee, fellas, I'm thinking of retiring, which, you only retire in a coffin from the mafia. But gee, I'm thinking of retiring. I've got these debts, and $100,000 would really go a long way to secure those debts, and I'd keep working for you. So I think he was testing them to see how much money he, and I think that was one of the primary motivations for Scarpa, money from the FBI and also protection. And then shortly after that, he raised a flag of possibly being asked to murder Joe Magliocco, who was going to be the successor to Joe Profaci. And I think he was testing the waters to see what the FBI would put up with. And so I think you're absolutely right, Vic, that early on he was manipulating, testing, kind of seeing, who held what cards.
Good mafia earner has many sources of income, bookmaking, Shylock, etc. It looked to me on reading the book and from what I've heard, Greg Scarpa was a huge earner. That's why he had that much power in the family that he was like a shark. He just did his own thing. They didn't want to tie him up as a capo going to meetings and stuff. What was Greg's? Can you go into some of the sources of Greg Scarpa's income?
Absolutely. One big source was hijacking both trucks and also shipments from Kennedy Airport. Apparently, he used to come home with duffel bags full of jewelry and just open them on the table and say to the woman he was living with, Linda, go ahead and pick a few nice pieces for yourself. So hijacking was a big source. Also, the protection racket in the neighborhood, also putting in these lotto machines in the neighborhood and making sure that his lotto machines got chosen. The insurance fraud, including theft, warehouse theft, and apparently arson as well. And the insurance fraud, I think, was particularly interesting because Scarpa would commit a theft worth $100,000 worth of merchandise, maybe a truck full of stereo parts or something like that. Then he would work with the insurance company and say, well, look, you guys can either pay Crazy Eddie 100% on this, or you can, I'll give you all the stuff back and you can pay me 30%. And they take the deal. Anthony Villano goes into this in his book. So there was many sources of income from Scarpa, and everything that I read, you're absolutely right. He was a big earner, and he was allowed to do his own thing. He had a fairly large crew for a guy who was just a good fellow at the time.
Greg Scarpa was a notorious womanizer. He was a bigamist at one point, but the one woman that basically is with him for decades is Linda Shiro. Shiro, can you go into that relationship?
Sure, and I've heard it pronounced both Shiro and Shiro. Anyway, they met in the early 1960s when Linda was still a teenager. She was a minor, in fact, and they met in a bar in the early 1960s. Greg was married at the time, 3 kids, a 4th on the way, and they started a relationship. And you're right, that relationship lasted until the day he died in 1994. Linda, at first there was some hesitance. Linda was actually involved with another good fellow, but Scarpa said, move over, Rover. Let Scarpa take over. Anyway, Scarpa and Linda ended up living together, and then Linda wanted to have children with him. Scarpa was still married at the time, although he and his wife Connie were separated. They never got divorced. But Linda wanted to have children, but she had this thing about raising her kids in the Catholic Church and didn't want to have them out of wedlock. And this kind of bizarre, sometimes these issues crop up, sometimes they're not important. And so she married this guy, Charlie Shiro, and she had 2 children with Charlie. Charlie eventually figured out what was going on. Charlie hit the trail, and then Linda and Greg moved in permanently and lived essentially held themselves out as man and wife, even though there's no common law of marriage in New York, for the rest of his life. And the last I've known, Linda's still alive.
Charlie Shiro, Linda's husband, I mean, he's married to her. She's got kids with Greg Scarpa that she at first passes off as they're his kids. Once he finds out who Greg Scarpa is, how did he take that?
Well, he was angry, no doubt. He stormed out. I think the event that kind of precipitated all of this is his purportedly a brand new son. A maid remarked about how much she looks like Craig, or how much he looks like Craig. And so Charlie Shiro immediately left, split with Linda. He was very angry, but I think that Charlie, and Vic, I don't have much information on this, but my sense is that Charlie realized who Greg Scarpa was, and maybe it was best to just get out of the picture quietly.
You know, another oddity about Greg Scarpa was the unorthodox relationship between himself, his mistress / common law wife, Linda Shiro, and Larry Mazza. Can you go into that?
Sure. That started in the late 1970s. By that time, Greg had been married a second time and then divorced. So he was, as you mentioned before, in fact, a bigamist. And by then they had two children. Greg and Linda had two children. And Linda decided that she wanted to sleep with Larry Mazza. She had seen him at the grocery store there in Brooklyn, and he was a delivery guy. And she told Greg, quite frankly, I want to sleep with Larry Mazza. And Greg said, whatever makes Linda happy. And so she and Larry carried on this affair for a couple of years, often in the house that Linda and Greg shared. And sometimes while Greg was in the house, he had this perfectly timed routine in the morning of showering, shaving, blow drying his hair. And Linda and Larry knew just how long he took doing that. And they took advantage of that to continue with their a very torrid sexual affair.
Linda seems like, to me, one of the few people that only person he really trusted. And we'll get into that later about the double dealing and everything. But he admits to Linda early on in their relationship to committing around 20 murders in 1962. Do you think that was bravado on his part? Or do you think he trusted her that much and he really had killed 20 people up to that point?
Yeah, it's impossible to know what the number is, Vic, but I think that there's some truth to it. I think that this wasn't something he just started doing all of a sudden in the 1960s or 1970s. I think that he was always a very dangerous guy once he was in the Profaci family. So it's hard to put a number on it. But I think there was a little bit of bragging going on there, but I don't think he would have said that if he hadn't felt, one, he could trust Linda, and second, if there wasn't some truth to it. I mean, because, if you say stuff like that and then this woman finds out it's complete nonsense, the party's over. She's gone.
Yeah, and everything with him was his reputation that comes into play much later on. And you did a lot of research for this book. It's very impressive. How many murders were you able to connect him to?
Well, I went through particularly the 1980s when we have some pretty good records based on what the FBI was able to put together. I don't have I don't have a specific number, but and I've heard numbers as high as like 125, and I think that's ridiculous. I think that eventually someone would have said, okay, this has got to stop. But I think the number's somewhere between 20 and 50, frankly. And I think during the 1980s, there are a number of murders, say in the low teens, that are pretty concretely tied to Scarpa, either him committing them, him being involved in them, or him ordering them.
Knowing what you know about Greg Scarpa, do you think he enjoyed killing or was just part of the job?
Yeah, I think it was just part of the job. I think he was, I'm not a psychologist, but I think he was a sociopath. I just think that he didn't have the sort of right and wrong switch that the rest of us have, or if he had it at one point in his life, it was gone and he'd gotten used to those sorts of things. So I think that was something that was part of the job, but also, Vic, I think it was part of his own survival. I think a number of these murders were done because he was concerned that someone might betray him, that someone might rat him out about his activity with the FBI.
This bizarre relationship he's got with the FBI and how much they trusted him and how they were hanging on every word to get information about the mob in the 60s when they really didn't have much. In June of 1964, 3 civil rights workers vanished in Mississippi, which was later shown in the movie Mississippi Burning. According to your sources, and I've read this in other places, the FBI sends Greg Scarpa down to Mississippi to solve this case. Can you go into that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, crazy, right? That the FBI would be looking around and say, well, how about Greg Scarpa, And I think by that time, the relationship between the FBI and Scarpa was solid enough that they knew what he was capable of. And their own hands were tied necessarily by law enforcement restraints like the Constitution, the law, those sorts of things. And that did not constrain Scarpa. And as I go through in the book, I think there are 3 major incidents in the civil rights section. And I think that the information on the 2 of the last 3 is pretty solid, that it's probably true that Scarpa went down and helped out on both the civil rights workers case, a phenomenally important case and sensational in 1964, and then on the Vernon Dahmer case a couple of years later. I've looked at the Medgar Evers case that Anthony Villano talks about, and I don't think he was involved in that. But yeah, just amazing that that would be, the FBI would consider Scarpa a tool in the toolbox.
Well, I got a kick. I laughed out loud and we came to that chapter, and I think it said Greg Scarpa, civil rights champion, or something to that effect. And I burst out laughing because he was in it for the money and to
Yeah.
keep himself out of jail. And they sent him down there to basically torture a few people to get information about these cases. And again, the amount of research you put into this book is amazing. And you looked at countless FBI documents. Many of these documents are well over 50, 60 years old. Yet many of them were redacted. What do you think the point of that is all these years later?
Yeah, I think, not to be, I'm not a conspiracy guy, but I am a little bit skeptical at times. And I think that the FBI, to the extent that they found it possible, I think many of the redactions were probably to save themselves from some kind of embarrassment. There might be a name that would be, people would just go like, oh my God, you got to be kidding me. Or there'd be an event that they feared they had to soft pedal. And there may be some other legitimate reasons for some people that are still alive that need protection, and their names just should not be appearing in these documents, because these documents are now available online. They're available to the public.
So Greg Scarpa kind of had two careers with the FBI. He had his first handler in the 60s into the 70s. Then he got deactivated. Then Lynn Del Vecchio picks him up later on. But at one point, Scarpa gets busted on a stock fraud case out of Newark, which it's another field office of which he's dealing with. And basically he gets on the phone and calls the case agent in Newark and so in sum and substance threatens the guy. And then the case is eventually dismissed because the FBI ran interference for him. Did Greg Scarpa ever serve any jail time during his reign on the street?
Yeah, he served about 30 days once he was on an attempted bribe charge. I think it was a gun possession charge, and I think he attempted to bribe an NYPD officer and who wasn't having any of it. And he spent 30 days in jail, and during a period when he's committing multiple murders, really just having the run of the place. And even in that stock fraud case, he was booked and then released on his own recognizance immediately. So he didn't even spend 24 hours in jail on that particular beef. And eventually it was about 2 years later, it was dismissed. And the exact reason is left to inference. And I think your inference is right, that they just didn't want to put Scarpa on the stand and have him talking about the FBI.
I think they were afraid of him to a degree because they didn't know what he would say.
I think you got the first half of that right, Vic. And I think the second half is they knew damn well what he was going to say.
Reading your book, Greg Scarpa's relationship with the FBI is almost the same deal Whitey Bulger up in Boston got, in that they knew what he was doing. They turned a blind eye to it, and they were lapping up everything he gave them. It's just amazing how they protected Greg Scarpa at all costs.
Yeah, to me, one of the incredible things is that here's a guy who barely finished high school, and he was manipulating a building full of professionals with college degrees. And these are not rookies. These are experienced people who've got a lot of job experience behind them. And so, yeah, it's incredible that Scarpa was able to do that. And as you point out, and as Lynn Vecchio pointed out in his book, he said, of course, in my heart of hearts, I knew he was still doing hits. And so, I mean, that's as tough as it gets. Murder.
Yeah, and the question begs to be asked, why didn't you stop it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that with DeVecchio, I think his career was tied to Scarpa. His movement in the FBI was tied to Scarpa. And so there's that motivation. And I think there must have been a feeling at the FBI, or a culture at the FBI, that as long as we're getting good information from this guy, and it's not, he's not shooting people like on, in front of ABC TV, then we're going to keep going with him.
Jonathan, having worked in organized crime years after Greg Scarpa, all they would have had to have done is surveilled him, and they didn't. And had they surveilled him, especially during the Colombo Wars, they would have caught him red-handed.
Well, yeah.
They would have done a car stop and found them. It's amazing how Charles Hines, we'll get into that, but during the Colombo War, basically the Brooklyn District Attorney and the U.S. Attorney's Office waived the Constitution and basically told the NYPD and the FBI, pull over these cars, toss these guys. We don't care if the gun charges get thrown out. We just want to stop all this shooting on the street. Yet they never did it to the main guy that's going around blowing people up.
Yeah, incredible, right? I mean, and this happened after the bagel shop murder. Finally, they said, we had this poor kid that got kind of caught in the crossfire, and they said, there was enough public clamor. They had to do something about it. Frankly, I think if that kid hadn't been killed, they might have let the Columbos go on killing each other for another couple of years. But, now that there was an innocent kid, an 18-year-old, just tragic. They said, okay, we got to do something. And you're right. I mean, Mazza's depiction of what they did on a daily basis, traveling around in this car that's just loaded to the gills with weapons and specifically designed for hunting human beings. Just a traffic stop would have brought a lot of that to an end.
Well, yeah, chances are, had they gone to pull them over for a traffic infraction, they would have taken off,
Yeah, I mean,
which would have upped the ante.
right.
That might have led to a reasonable search. It sounded, we'll get into the Columbo Wars in a minute, but the Columbo Wars sounded like something out of Chicago in the 1920s with Al Capone. I mean, that's just how brazen they were. In addition to so Greg Scarpa must have trusted Linda Shiro so much so. I'm reading the book and I couldn't believe that he early on basically told her he was an FBI informant.
Yeah, I think that he got a good sense, and this is one of the things about Greg Scarpa that I think points to his intelligence. I think he got a good sense of who Linda was. And as several people have pointed out, Linda wasn't disgusted by any of this. She
No.
wasn't put off by any of this. She was fascinated by it. She'd been around mobsters her grandmother was running numbers. And so she'd been around mobsters for quite a while. I think part of it, if you fast forward a little bit from that first bit of their relationship, and Vic, you know this from living in New York, and just how prevalent particularly in the 70s and into the 80s, the mob was in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And, some of these guys talk about how they were just running New York. And so it was not unusual for Linda to be in a relationship with somebody from the mafia. And for her, I think the fact that he was a big shot was a plus, not a minus.
Greg Scarpa also claimed to Linda he had done work for the CIA. Do you
Yeah,
believe that?
No, I don't. I think that at some point, the stories got a little too big. Based on my research, some of those stories came out when I think that Greg was suffering from dementia due to the AIDS. So I don't believe that he was working for the CIA. And maybe I got it wrong. Maybe the CIA said, well, if the FBI can do it, let's get in on the party, right?
During the early 80s, a car service driver foolishly attempted to rape Greg Scarpa's daughter. Can you tell us what happened to him?
Yeah, well, at first he got a beating, a pretty vicious beating from Scarpa's crew. And he, as you mentioned, he was taking Linda to school, and instead of going to school, he pulled over into a wooded area and started to molest her. And one of the amazing things about this story is Linda Scarpa's ability to keep calm. And she said, hey, let's just meet later. Of course, this guy fell for it. He's like, yeah, that sounds great. And because some of these guys aren't too bright, and he was one of them. And anyway, so she told her mom, and of course told Greg. And the first thing that happened was he was, as Larry Mazza says, savagely beaten. And then apparently Greg felt like that's not enough. He's got to go. So he was murdered as a result of what he had done to Linda. And frankly, the way Linda tells that story, I think it's completely credible.
Son Greg Jr. would eventually follow his father into the mafia, and he had a unique upbringing. Can you go into that?
Yeah, sure. On the one hand, his upbringing was like a lot of kids. His dad wanted him to go to school. He insisted on 100% attendance. He liked to do some athletic things with his son. Used to go to his son's Little League games, and Greg would try to steal signals and send them to us. So,
Yeah.
he couldn't change his stripes even for that. But he taught his son how to box. But then when Greg was 16, he got in a fight in high school, and he came home with a goose egg on his forehead. And Greg Sr. was asking him about it. And Greg Jr. was trying to play it down. Like, Dad, no big deal. He got in a fair lick. It's no big deal. But Greg said, if that boy doesn't go to the hospital tomorrow, then don't bother coming home. So, Greg Jr., Dad, like for a lot of us, his dad was everything for him. He beat the kid so severely, he went to the hospital, and then Greg was expelled. And that put Greg really squarely on this path towards the life. Greg Jr., by all accounts, was a genuine tough guy. He wasn't just somebody who's like hiding behind his father or just going around saying, hey, I'm a tough guy. Greg was a genuine tough guy, and he got into the life big time, especially drug dealing eventually.
I saw Greg Jr. on an interview, and he was talking to the narrator, and a story came up. I don't know if you know about this, but there was an argument between Greg Jr. And Charlie Moose, or there was a dispute about who was going to get Greg Jr., whose crew he was going to be in after Greg Jr. followed his father into life. And Greg Scarpa basically told Charlie Moose, like, to back off or I'll kill you. And Charlie Moose was not someone to be played with. He was just as vicious and evil as Greg Scarpa. And Gregory Jr. is like, Dad, what are you doing? He goes, don't worry about it. Like, he was so confident, but Greg Jr. follows his father into the mob, is a huge earner just like Dad. And he gets promoted to capo. And there's a great quote. I had to read it like 4 times. There's a great quote in your book by Gregory Scarpa's son that sums up his father. And he goes, although I was a capo and my father was just a soldier, I knew if I ever disrespected or crossed him in any way, he would have found a way, no matter how long it took him, and I would wind up dead. That's a son talking about his father.
Yeah, and it's just kind of tragic that Greg spent half his life in a federal prison
Yeah.
as a result of following his father into the life. And Greg had an enlightenment shortly after all that and said he was done with these guys. He felt guilt about the people whose lives he had harmed, and it's just kind of tragic because at heart, even though he did a lot of really terrible things.
Oh, yeah.
Greg Jr. comes off to me as kind of a good guy, and I don't mean that in the sense
No.
that good guys versus bad guys. I mean, I think he's, at the core, he's kind of a good guy and just went down this path, idolized his dad, etc. But, the corollary to that is what Greg Scarpa did to another guy he considered a son of his, Joe Brewster. And so I think Greg Scarpa Jr. got it absolutely right.
Well, and then Greg Scarpa, after he got convicted, Greg Scarpa Jr. got convicted, and I guess his father visited him in prison or someone visited him in prison, and he basically said, I'm done with this life. I got like 100 years in jail. It's brought me nothing but misery. And once Greg Sr. was told that or found out about it, told anyone else in the family, if you talk to my son about family business, you're dead. So basically he's telling them, like, my son is dead to me.
Yeah, he cut him off financially. He cut off Greg's wife and children financially, and cut him off socially. From a mob point of view, just completely cut him off. And you're right, that was his oldest son.
What's so ironic is Greg Scarpa's base of operations was the Wimpy Boys Social Club in Brooklyn. I always got such a kick out of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the club, what you know about it?
Sure. It was a gym. And that's why it was called the Wimpy Boys. It was a place that was to draw in people and say, come on, get buffed up here. So originally it was a gym. And as you probably know, Vic, these social clubs were all over Brooklyn at the time. I've seen a map of these things, and it's incredible. They're so close to each other, and there's so many of them. So the Wimpy Boys gym apparently went out of business, and Scarpa rented it, and it had a main area in the front, like you would expect from a gym, fairly expansive, fairly large, where the guys hung out on most days, playing cards, making sandwiches, getting sent out to do various tasks that they had to do. And it also had Scarpa's office, and that was in the back.
You're talking about Joe Delmonico, a.k.a. Joe Brewster, who was often referred to as Greg Scarpa's other son. Can you tell us what happened to him?
Yeah, Joe was a longtime friend of Greg Scarpa's, going back to at least the early 60s. And Joe had some pretty special skills. He was a very skilled burglar and was in a lot of bank burglaries done during off hours. Joe just had this particular skill, this bypass skill of bypassing the alarms and just emptying out safety boxes or safety deposit boxes. And he worked for Greg. And rumor has it that at one point he started talking about leaving, getting out of the life. And some people ascribed it to, he had a girlfriend who was a born-again Christian, and Joe was going to be a born-again Christian too. So that was the rumor, and a contract went out on his life. And Scarpa, I think, probably didn't believe the rumor, but what he was worried about was Joe talking about Greg Scarpa and the FBI. And so eventually, Joe was killed. Joe was killed by Greg Scarpa Jr. They're driving along, and they said, hey, we'll give you a ride tonight to this event. And if you ever hear that from one of these guys, say, look, I'll take an Uber. But we'll give you a ride tonight. And on the way there, a gun had been placed under the front shotgun seat, and he turned around and he killed Joe Brewster. Vic, what's to me is amazing about that whole scenario is he had a debriefing with Linda Vecchio the next day, and he mentioned it. He said Joe Brewster was killed. And from the documents, it doesn't appear that Linda Vecchio said, "Well, Greg, who killed him?" Or "How'd that happen? Why don't you tell me a little more about that?" And of course, Scarpa used the passive voice. Joe Brewster was killed. And then he went on and gave a few more sort of details about a few things happened in the family that were just fairly routine. And this is the day after a guy that he considered his son of his
Yeah.
had been killed on his own orders, and just cold-blooded, in my view.
Of all the murders Greg Scarpa committed, the senseless murder of Mary Barry stands out.
Oh, yeah, that one's that's heart-wrenching. This was a young girl who'd got involved with another mob member who was on the lam up in Connecticut. Apparently, they had this, like, underground railroad for the
Yeah.
the
I
mob.
got a kick out of that.
Yeah, and so, anyway, it was a Persico, and the word got around that Mary was maybe gonna tell the FBI or the U.S. Marshal's office, who was looking for Alley Boy Persico, where he was, and as it turned out, nobody knew where he was. His own family didn't know where he was. But that word kind of got out. Oh, maybe she's talking to some cops. Maybe she's talking to the FBI. And as it turned out, she was working for the FBI. At least that was my conclusion from what I saw. But I don't think she was killed because they were worried about her. That Greg Scarpa was worried about her telling the FBI where Alley Boy Persico was. I mean, Greg Scarpa was telling the FBI that Carmine Persico was murdering people. Why would he care about Alley Boy going to jail? So
Right.
anyway, long story, already too long, short. Mary was brutally murdered in Carmine Sessa's club. And the I think pretty reliable story is that she was pinned to the ground by Scarpa Jr. and Greg shot her, and she was so unrecognizable that they had to identify her by a tattoo, and that was it. So just heartbreaking.
Do you think Greg Scarpa's handler, FBI agent Linda Vecchio, was involved in that? That he leaked information to Greg that she wasn't a CI? You think that's
You know,
possible?
I don't think so. I think that
Okay.
I'm not sure that it's the kind of thing that DeVecchio would have known because a lot these things were highly compartmentalized within the
Right.
FBI. I don't think that I think that there was some conversation that was alleged that Linda Vecchio said Mary is going to be an informant and you have to take care of that problem. And to me, that just doesn't ring true because DeVecchio was skilled in terms of knowing what the mafia was like. So, I mean, if you told Greg, this person is going to inform on you, that's all you had to say. You didn't have to say, oh, and by the way, you have to take care of that problem. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I think that that's been played up. I don't know that it'll ever be resolved one way or the other. I know there are a lot of people that feel that DeVecchio was involved in that, but I'm not convinced.
During the 80s, Greg Scarpa, big drinker, would take aspirins every day to hopefully fend off a hangover, has ulcers, has surgery. He contracts AIDS from a blood transfusion because one of his guys was using needles and he didn't want hospital blood. So, do you think AIDS made him more dangerous?
Well, yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Especially during the Third Colombo War when he was really starting to deteriorate. I mean, he had it's tough to parse out the psychology of this, but he had some doubts about how other people perceived him when he was starting to deteriorate. But I think at some point during the early 90s, I think it occurred to Greg Scarpa, what have I got to lose?
Yeah. Yeah,
So, yeah.
I agree with you. And in the early 90s, so basically Carmine the Snake Persico, the boss of the Colombos, is in jail.
Mhm.
He installs little Vic Arena to run the family as like a street boss. Arena likes the power. John Gotti is blowing smoke up his ass. You should run the family. Arena starts taking a poll and all hell breaks loose. There's a war between Persico's faction, which is Greg Scarpa and others, against Vic Arena, who wants to take over the family. And Greg Scarpa was a pivotal character during this conflict. Can you go into that for us?
Sure. He's often referred to as the leader of the Persico faction in that conflict in the Colombo family. And one of the things that was happening was when Vic was the acting boss, he had the power to name new members. And most of the
Right.
new members he was naming were from Queens, people that were local to him. And as Larry Mazza said, the Brooklyn guys, not so much. And one of the things that did was it meant that all that earning was going up to Vic Arena and the Queens Capos and not to the Brooklyn guys. So they had the numbers in their favor on the arena side. And I've concluded in the book that, and it's a pretty easy conclusion, that I think that the uh, Persico loyalist label that Scarpa is given is phony. I think
Right.
that Scarpa was a Scarpa loyalist, and he knew that with Vic Arena naming all these members, that money was not going to be flowing to him and other people that are above him, the way the money flows up in the mafia hierarchy. So I think that that's what Scarpa saw as the real threat, was the threat to his income. And it turned into a shooting war where several people were killed.
I couldn't believe what I was reading. The Third Colombo War is raging. People are getting killed every day. Scarpa and his guys are driving around shooting at them. They're shooting at him. Yet Lynn Del Vecchio, even at the end, when Greg Scarpa's starting to get arrested now, and they try to deactivate him, and he's, I mean, just like going above and beyond to keep him on the street and keep him active. I mean, I think Del Vecchio got so sucked in by this, and you're right, his FBI career was tied to Scarpa that it was like, for me, it looked embarrassing.
Yeah, I think that another part of that was I think that DeVecchio, he sort of idolized the mob life and
Yeah.
idolized a lot of these guys. And he writes that I considered Greg Scarpa my friend. I told him there were limits, but I considered him my friend. But, I think that that was part of it too. It was not only a career issue for Lynn, but I think it was also a personal issue and how he felt about Greg Scarpa. And yeah, he went to bat for him when I think it
Why?
was way beyond the rabbit-proof fence. I think it was time to say, yeah, we got to stop.
That's like having a rattlesnake as a friend, because at some point you're going to get bit. He just went on and on and on. And Greg Scarpa, I got, he was definitely an interesting character, and he would go to great lengths to kill a rival. And at one point, he was going to dress up like a Hasidic Jew on Thanksgiving Day so he could get close and kill arena loyalist Bill Catullo.
Yeah, that's a crazy sort of gang that couldn't shoot straight idea, right? And the only thing that stopped that was a story in the New York Post that came out that alleging that Scarpa was an FBI agent. So instead of going on the hit, they had to do some damage control, and the Billy's location at this heavily Hasidic Jewish place in our neighborhood in Brooklyn was no longer important anymore. But yeah, that was the plan. So that was pretty crazy. And I just, like I said, I just can't imagine these guys walking around that section of neighborhood and saying things like "yo" and
Yeah, shalom. And
yeah, right. So very crazy, and Billy at least momentarily escaped execution as a result.
Greg Scarpa had a brother Sal who gets murdered in his Diker Heights social club, and on the surface it looks like a robbery. Gunmen break in with masks, and they start ripping people off, and then supposedly Sal Scarpa, who's probably a tough guy like his brother, resists, and he gets shot in the head and the chest 2 times. Now, obviously, to me, that looked like a hit. No one else was touched. Do you think that Greg was ordered his brother's murder?
I think it's an open question, but it wouldn't surprise me. I think that Sal was an irritant to Greg. Sal was not as skilled as Greg. He was borrowing money from him. They had a bad relationship. Linda Shiro said that they're always banging heads, and I think it's not inconceivable that Greg ordered that hit. I don't think the evidence is entirely clear on it, except I agree with you. It was not a robbery. A lot of Sal's stuff was just left on him, like his wallet and his ring. So again, he was the only guy shot in the alleged burglary. So to answer your question, I don't think it's clear, but I don't think it's out of the question.
Was Sal Scarpa killed before the Third Colombo War?
Yes.
See, to me, that looks like Greg Scarpa did it, and I'll tell you, it just in my opinion.
Sure.
When his son got shot in the ass by a cab driver, he told his kid, go back there and kill that son of a bitch. Anybody that he perceived as a slight or try to get over on him or one of his guys, the cab driver, they gave him the savage beat, and he's like, no, you know what? He's got to go. That someone would go into his brother's social club and kill another Scarpa, and nothing happened to that. And he didn't scour the earth trying to find out who did it, and bodies weren't turning up in the street. To me, that shows he had a hand in it.
Yeah, I think that's a good analysis. I think that that's entirely possible. That's exactly how it went. On the other side, Vic, I got to believe that because of their relationship, that was antagonistic for a long time, that if someone else had killed Sal and it got back to Greg, I think he would have just shrugged his shoulders. Well, I don't think he would have made a big deal about it because I think Sal was one of those things that just would pop up every now and then, and Greg would have to deal with it. And he didn't. He was not fond of his brother. So either way, but I think your analysis is good.
In the end, Greg's dying and he's running out of favors with the federal government. They're listening, but they're not listening. They're kind of cutting him off. And yet he never tries to save his most trusted lieutenants, Greg Jr., who's in jail, try to work out a deal for him, maybe tell them where some bodies are buried, to maybe get him moved to a nicer prison or get him out of jail. And he never tries to save Larry Mazda. What's crazy to me, and I never knew about this, and in your book, after the Third Colombo War is basically over, and it's going back to business as usual, and Greg's under house arrest before he gets ultimately put away. He's basically like on Larry and his guys about paying him money that was owed during the war. They couldn't make their collections because they're in a car with him every day hunting people. Now it's big because, you owe me this. I just couldn't. And he never tried to save Larry Mazza or his son from prosecution. What's your opinion on why he never tried to help them?
Yeah, let me just back up just a little bit. In fact, after Larry was in MCC and had been arrested, Linda Shiro went to the home of Larry's parents trying to collect on the vig that he owed on, and the debt and the principal that he owed to Greg. Anyway, so was painfully loyal.
Yeah, looks it.
And, he was a young man, very impressionable, and by all accounts, this NYPD officer that he grew up with, Tommy Dades, talked about him and said, if a great guy like Larry can get flipped to the life, it could happen to anybody. But I think that ultimately the loyalty that Larry showed to Greg was important to Greg only as long as it was useful to Greg.
Yeah.
And that was it. And by the time Greg was in, a prison hospital in Minnesota, it didn't really matter anymore. And brings it back to your earlier point, and that is that the one human that he was really loyal to was Linda. And the other people, he did a little favor to try to help Alley Boy out, said, Alley Boy, I never heard of him. I don't know this guy, Alley Boy. But he didn't do anything for his son, and he didn't do anything for Larry or anyone else. And I think it just adds on to the evidence that his primary loyalty was to Greg Scarpa.
Having worked with informants, I've got a theory on it. To me, I've never dealt with an informant that was 100% told me everything. They always hold back. They always want that get out of jail, no matter how bleak it is for them. Come clean. This is it. This is your one shot. And they'll tell you most of what happened, but for whatever reason, they hold back. And I personally think, even though his mind was going and everything else is out, I really think Greg Scarpa was more concerned of dying at home or getting into a more favorable prison that, yeah, these guys can fend for themselves. I'm going to need whatever he had locked up in that head of his. I think he took to the grave with him, thinking that maybe one day he could die at home or it would help him somehow down the road.
Yeah, interesting. I wish I'd talked to you before I wrote this, just because that insight, I think, is particularly keen, that the life of an informant runs that way. This is not quite the same thing, but I practiced law for 10 years. And one of the things that I didn't understand as a junior lawyer, but I came to understand, is that my clients were always holding back. And they were always telling this. Yeah, they were telling the story the way they wanted it to be told. And, after a few beatings, I figured out, okay, I've got to take this with a grain of salt. But, maybe that's just a human characteristic. And it comes out particularly in the informant life, the way you're talking about it. That's a really good insight.
After all the research you did in this book, do you think Greg Scarpa had any redeeming qualities?
Not by the end of his life. I'm not the kind of guy that says like, oh, we just got to kill him. We got to get rid of him. He's a human being, but he had some chances and he never availed himself of those chances to disavow all of this stuff. And he was right to the end. He was lying. And then Vic, as we talked about it in the other day in our phone conversation, his common law wife, or whatever you want to call her, Linda, was convinced that even if Greg were allowed to die at home, he would have, in that condition that he was in, he would have killed somebody. And so she knew him as well as anybody. And
Oh, yeah.
so he never even seems to have sought redemption. He just sought what's best for Greg Scarpa right up till the very end.
Do you know if he regretted any of the murders he committed?
Well, we talked about the Joe Brewster murder, and he kind of put it on Joe. He said, why'd that guy have to do that?" And I think he was talking about some of the changes that Joe was making in his life, and he seemed to have regretted that. And his daughter Linda indicated that there was another older gangster that got killed during the Third Colombo War that he felt bad about. I think he might have felt bad about it for 10 minutes, and then, let's go get some pasta and a scotch.
This wasn't in your book, but considering the amount of research you did to get this book going, I was just curious. Do you think that Greg Scarpa had any connection to the murder of another Colombo mobster, Mimi Sciallo?
That name comes up in my research, and as you said earlier on, Vic, I tried to be very careful about just kind of going out on a limb and saying, "Hey, this probably happened, that probably happened." But there's certainly remains a lot of mystery about what Greg Scarpa did. There's no doubt, because he lived in the shadows. He lived in a world of lies. He didn't give press releases about, "Hey, I just killed Joe Brewster.
Right.
Thought you want to know there, Jerry Capizzi," but he so there are lots of possibilities in terms of Greg Scarpa's involvement in unsolved murders or questionable murders. So I wouldn't want to rule anything out, but I didn't come up with anything that really
Okay.
focused in on that.
Just curious, yeah, because I was reading through the book and I've read about that murder and I just was always curious. So, Jonathan, again, what's the name of your book, which is a great book, and where can our listeners pick up a copy?
Sure, it's called Greg Scarpa, Legendary Evil: The Many Faces of a Mafia Killer, and it's available online. Lots of booksellers, Copperfield's Books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Just search Greg Scarpa, Legendary Evil, and it'll come up.
Jonathan Dyer, thank you so much for spending your time with us today.
Vic, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Great conversation.
Thank you. As always, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in, especially my listeners in the Bronx, New York, West Palm Beach, Florida, Lawrenceburg, Indiana, Vero Beach, Florida, Arlington, Virginia, and Sparta, New Jersey. If you work in law enforcement or had an interesting criminal background, please drop me a note on Twitter or Instagram at VicFerrari50. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you enjoy the content, check out my Amazon author page. Just type in my name, Vic, Ferrari like the car, where you can preview all my NYPD books for free. Thanks again, everyone. I'll see you next week.